Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our final Professional Development Week session. So you want to get a job in DC. My name is Kayla Houston, and I am the Communications Manager here at New. As you know, this week is our annual Professional Development Week, where we focus on programming and content to help the women in our network advance in the workplace. Today, we are joined by Kyle Bonnell from the Heritage Foundation to discuss the ins and outs for landing your dream job in DC. So to briefly go over format, I'll share a quick bio of Kyle, and then we will jump in with some questions. After that, we can open it up to Q&A. So please feel free to engage with others in the chat, drop any questions in the chat or the Q&A that you have, and we can have him answer them. So for Kyle's bio, Kyle Bonnell is the Assistant Director for the Job Bank and Talent Placement at the Heritage Foundation. Through the Heritage Job Bank, Kyle has placed over 1,000 conservatives into key positions on Capitol Hill in the executive branch and with conservative organizations across the country. He has worked on staff at Heritage for 11 years. In 2016, he served on the Trump transition team and the Domestic Policy Appointments Group. In the fall of 2021, he was part of the personnel team for Governor Youngkin's transition team. He is a proud Ohio native, born in Dayton and raised in Middleton. He graduated from Miami University with a bachelor's degree in political science. Thank you so much for joining us today, Kyle.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Well, I just wanted to go over a quick disclaimer before we go into the questions and say that as Heritage and New are 501c3s, this isn't individual advice and that we can't give any special advice around political campaigns or appointments, but we can definitely ask any other questions. So all right, so we'll jump right in. Kyle, for those who may not know, what is the Job Bank and what is your role specifically at Heritage?
Oh, thank you. Love the question. So for context, the Heritage Foundation is a conservative think tank based in Washington, D.C. We focus primarily on kind of federal policy, turning conservative principles into policy ideas that can then be enacted, kind of through government. So we're very focused on really detailed solutions to the problems of the day. And very early on in Heritage's history, 40 plus years ago, when Heritage was still new and small, Heritage created a job bank. Because the Heritage founder, realized early on that people are policy. That's a phrase, if you haven't heard it before, you'll probably hear often throughout your career if you work in the conservative movement. And people are policy is kind of the realization that you don't really get policy victories. Policy ideas don't become reality unless you get conservatives in really key jobs who know what they're doing in that job, who are trained, equipped, and then put in positions to apply principles to kind of modern day problems on the job. And that's why Heritage has a job bank. So the job bank is essentially an external conservative career program at Heritage, where Heritage helps conservative professionals get matched with conservative employers. That way, all the good conservatives who are being trained up in the conservative movement are being put in positions to apply all their skills and knowledge, and that the conservative employers who are so essential to policy victories have the talented people they need to succeed. So my job focuses on kind of making the matches between the talented conservatives and the really key employers, of which there are many across the country, and definitely concentration here in DC where we need all the help that we can get. So the job bank's big picture task is to make as many of those good matches as possible between the conservatives and the employers. I've been working on that in some form or fashion at Heritage for the last 11 years or so. Early on, I was focused on staff recruiting, so helping Heritage hire managers, hire for their positions, reading tens of thousands of applications and whittling them down to a few finalists, and focused on internal hiring. For a few years, my focus was on the external organizations and the kind of Heritage network. For a couple of years, the priority was helping find conservative staff for the Trump administration during those years, following up on my time on the transition team. I worked a little bit, as Kaylee mentioned, on the Youngkin transition team a couple of years ago. The Heritage tries to be very timely relevant. So if there are a lot of new members of Congress hiring for positions, right after their elections. There's a new White House hiring, a new governor hiring nearby. Heritage tries to help by kind of matching the key personnel to those positions So I really love my work here at Heritage because I've gotten to work on a lot of cool projects in the staffing realm and really gotten to learn a lot about how the hiring works. I talk to a lot of job seekers. I'm talking to a lot of employers and try to sync what I learn from both sides and making matches there. Make sure employers know what the talent's looking for, and make sure the job seekers know what employers are looking for, and try to reconcile those two things. So the job bank tries to help me to make those connections. We do that a few different ways. The job bank has a list that we curate. So every Tuesday and Friday, we add 10 to 20 new jobs to a published list of new positions across the conservative movement. And we send it out to our subscribers every Tuesday, Friday evening. Those are jobs that can be published, and we want to make sure the employers get their jobs out there and noticed, and make sure that conservatives know what opportunities are being publicized that they can be pursuing, applying for. But as you might have heard earlier this week, a lot of positions in the conservative movement, especially in DC, don't really get publicized. I think I'm one of the very few people in the movement who enjoys reading resumes. Most people really don't enjoy doing that. So a lot of people who hire for really key positions don't want to collect 100 or 200 resumes for a job. They want to talk to 3 or 4 people, get 5 or 6 quick recommendations, and make a quick hire, just word of mouth without ever publicizing openings. And I'm very active on that front too. So the job bank has our publication we send out. We publicize openings. We also work more quietly in the openings that don't get publicized. So we take in resumes through our job bank page. We work with our good friends like New on knowing which people are on the market who need jobs, who are standouts, and then help people find jobs more behind the scenes for those unpublished openings. That's basically job bank. It's kind of the programmatic embodiment of people or policy, kind of working day to day to make timely matches for really important positions across the conservative movement. And through the job bank, we're also always happy to talk to people one-on-one about kind of their career path, their job searches, anything big or small. So I know a lot of what I do is in these presentations give good best practices, foundational advice, but I'm always happy to talk, one-on-one on how to apply that to people's specific career interests and aspirations.
Yeah, definitely. I know it's super important for organizations when they're hiring for a position to know that someone's on the same page and even just a good fit for them. So I think that most of the women in our audience are familiar with jobs on the Hill. But can you talk big picture about other types of opportunities available in DC within the conservative movement? And what other types of roles are posted in the job bank?
So love to. It's a lot to chew on. I will start by emphasizing Capitol Hill is really important, so I don't want to downplay that. If you have any interest at all in going to the House, the Senate, I highly recommend it. It's a good career Kickstarter, for better or for worse, often for worse. Capitol Hill staff have outside responsibilities early in their careers, and they tend to grow pretty quickly. And those positions tend to translate well to any other employer, kind of across DC, across the conservative movement. That's usually my biggest focus throughout the years, kind of helping to fill those positions. They're just so critical, and there are never enough good people doing them. But beyond the House and the Senate, there are your traditional think tanks in DC, like Heritage, I guess the one I'm standing in right now, Family Research Council, American Enterprise Institute, Charlotte Lozier Institute. These are organizations that study policy and come up with kind of timely policy solutions based on certain principles. Think tanks, maybe a third of think tank staff might be scholars, but think tanks are organizations, so they also have fundraisers, people who do accounting, HR, business type roles, event planners, communicators, really every type of career discipline imaginable. So also think tanks in DC because it's so close to the federal government and the policy makers. There are a lot of other kind of policy groups in the movement up here in DC as well that fit loosely in the category of policy and advocacy groups. Groups like Conservative Partnership Institute, Center for Renewing America, the Federalist Society, Media Research Center. If you're pro-life, there's Susan B. Anthony, Pro-Life America, American Design for Life. So a lot of groups that might have a focus more on advocacy or training or focusing on 1 or 2 key issues as opposed to a broader range of them. So a lot of good nonprofit groups up here, think tank and otherwise. If you're interested in journalism, there are also good outlets up here that hire. There's the dailies like Daily Caller, Daily Signal, kind of here at Heritage, Washington Free Beacon, Washington Examiner, Town Hall, a National Review, The Federalist. A lot of opportunity in DC, kind of in that realm. For any of you who are thinking of law school, which I think is most poli-sci majors, if memory serves, there are also good law firms up here in DC that are kind of conservative. Maybe the biggest is Alliance Defending Freedom, just about a mile up the road from me here. They have a lot of good attorneys on staff who do a lot of really good work in the courts for the conservative movement. So they obviously hire for attorneys, but also for everything. They're communicators, event planners, paralegals, fundraisers. So a lot of good jobs also in the legal side of things up here in DC. Then you also see some groups that are kind of more private sector, but tend to focus on conservative clients. Those usually fall in the categories of PR and development. In development, there are groups like American Philanthropic or AC Fitzgerald that help nonprofit conservative groups with their fundraising. PR firms like CRC, Pinkston, Athos, and groups like that. So there are a lot of different types of employers in DC. There is, House and Senate. There are your think tanks, your other nonprofits, law firms, journalism, and the biggest one that I wanted to end on with this question is, the White House. Obviously, right now, the White House I would not categorize as a conservative employer, but if that were to, change in the years to come, that could be a good place for conservatives to work. So essentially, every U.S. president gets to hire about 4,000 people personally, who are political appointees who serve at the pleasure of the president. So the president can personally hire them, the president can personally fire them. And they are, part of the, less than 1% of the executive branch that isn't, civil servant or isn't, part of the quote unquote, deep state. So I was here for the Trump administration when, there are always 4,000 conservatives in those jobs. And the way that usually works is that when a president is elected, they have about 2 months to line up about 4,000 hires. A small fraction of their hires will work in the White House proper, the most kind of visible spot in administration. But they're also, political appointees who work for the president, on their behalf all across the government. So the president will have, staff who will work at the Department of Defense, Department of State, Department of Transportation, Department of Commerce, Energy, Interior, Small Business Administration, Department of Labor, EPA, on down the line. And that can be a really good place for a conservative to start their career. I think there's a common misperception that it's only cabinet secretaries and press secretaries because those are the people you see most often. If you're not in DC, you're not kind of plugged in. But of the 4,000 people a president would hire as a political appointee, most of those people are, rank and file. And that's, I guess, at least 1,000 of those people would be probably in their early to mid 20s. People who are supporting the cabinet secretaries or the deputy press secretaries, the kind of the junior event planners. So there are a lot of opportunities there, if the president of the time is so inclined to hire conservatives. I encourage you to keep that in mind, especially as the events of the year unfold. And one thing I'll emphasize is that there's just so much variety in the types of employers and the career disciplines. And most employers will have, all the career disciplines built into it. So at Heritage, we have our communications, media relations, digital departments. Every senator has a communications director, a digital director. Every cabinet secretary has the same equivalent. And if you don't want to work in those categories, there are PR firms. So whether you want to do communications, event planning, policy, accounting, finance, IT, scheduling, those jobs can be found within just about every category of conservative employer up here in DC. There's so many directions you can go with that job-wise. One thing I always emphasize and encourage people to do is not to let the great be the enemy of the good. If one job seems compelling, it's not your dream job, I say do it anyways, because things can move very quickly early in your career and in DC, as elections tend to kind of shake up the hiring landscape. And one thing I've learned from reading tens of thousands of resumes is that careers are generally not just a straight climb up a ladder. There's some zigging, there's some zagging. There are a lot of jobs you never expected to hear about when you're in college that merge mid-career. But So I encourage you to be open to all opportunities and know that it's not hard to move from government to nonprofit to private and vice versa. There's just a lot of mobility between career disciplines and types of employers up here.
That is very true. I know in this world, a lot of us who have worked in this, very nuanced, to most people, oftentimes you're always doing different things. And sometimes, however, an election turns out, sometimes will change your path. That's definitely happened to me in the past. But that's why what you do is so important because it seems like there's a lot of opportunities out there and you can really help people find something that fits best for them. From what you have seen, what are the best things women can do in college to set them up for getting the job that they want in the conservative movement?
Sure. The first piece of advice I'd have is if you can, go intern. Internships are essentially extended job interviews. If there's some place you really want to work full time someday, as best you can, try to intern for them before you graduate, hit the job market. Employers tend to, like hiring their former interns and usually look to them first when hiring for positions, especially at the entry level. Hiring can be risky. Um, if you're a director or a president of an organization, your success is dependent on how well people who work for you perform on the job and how much you can trust them. And people tend to trust people they've already worked with and proven themselves. So look at internships um, both as a way to build experience and to get a very practical foot in the door. And that was how I wound up on staff at Heritage. I interned here and applied for every job opening that popped up at Heritage while I was here 12 years ago. Conned to one of the 10 openings and been here ever since. And at any given time, roughly 50 of my colleagues were Heritage interns too, who are on staff here. And I've seen it play out over and over. A lot of White House interns became White House staff. Capitol Hill offices, if their staff assistant leaves, they look to the intern across the lobby and see if they're ready to jump up in a full-time job. And even if you don't go right from your internship to your job, employers will usually have enough memory to look back a year or two at their recent interns and see who's on the market or who might want to make a move. So go do internships while you can, definitely for the foot in the door, and also just to get the practical experience, kind of working in the industry in an office. Employers usually like to see that you've had some kind of exposure to the kind of professional world before they potentially, take a gamble on hiring you onto a full-time staff position where there's so much more kind of riding on your performance there. So go do internships. Be the students who follow up. The conservative movement, especially new Heritage as well, offer a lot of resources for students. People who say, "Feel free to shoot me an email afterwards," or "I'm happy to talk," usually mean that. The people who actually follow through and do that are very few and far between. So it's taking initiative and actually following up with people who kind of offer their services. Highly recommend that. Build genuine relationships professionally, well, and personally, but definitely professionally for this purpose. If you are interning somewhere, your freshman, sophomore year of college, and hope to get their help finding a job 2 years later, you don't want to forget about them or be a student who comes out of the woodwork 2 years later and says, "Hey, you remember me from 2 years ago? Well, I need a job now. Here's my resume." So the people you've worked with or for in the past, you had a good experience, make it a point to have intentional communication. Um, don't only reach out when you need something. Every 6 months or so, mention a new project you're working on, mention a new internship, new classes you're taking, ask them how they're doing, so that 2 years later you're a stranger to them when you're asking for their help finding positions. Also encourage you, if you're trying to think about your first job, is to hone in on the skills you'll need. In a lot of ways, job applications and interviews can be like open book tests. If you look at the job descriptions right now for the positions you want when you graduate, you can look at the job responsibilities and you can look at the required skills. As best you can, figure out the best way to get those skills, those experiences before you graduate. That way, when the time comes, your resume will kind of match the positions that you'll be applying for. Definitely hone in on the hard skills. If you see a lot of positions in communications require being able to edit video, find a way to take a video editing class. If it requires being able to make infographics, give yourself a crash course in Adobe InDesign and Canva. So figure out what the skills are that are really emphasized for entry-level jobs sooner than later, and start to cultivate the skills and make sure they're very, kind of clear on your resume. And I guess the last jump piece of advice along these lines is be smart about your online presence. The things you might have on social media online that you got by with as an intern applicant, you might not get by with when you're applying for full-time positions. Kind of the scrutiny on your online presence intensifies as you try to kind of climb the career ladder. So know that really just about any employer will either formally or informally research you before they consider making you a job offer. So kind of manage your online presence accordingly. Don't put anything online that suggests that you could become a PR problem. And also make sure that your social media presence and content kind of reflects your own values, both in terms of policy and in terms of character. So be very intentional about how you kind of manage your online presence, especially because it's going to be a big part of your job search.
Yeah, definitely. And it's so true that in internships you learn so much. And a lot of when you're doing an internship, a lot of managers will actually want to give you tasks that you want to learn about. I know with our interns, oftentimes about halfway through the internship, I'm always like, is there anything that you want to try? Is there anything you haven't learned that you feel like you want more experience with? Because we can definitely work that in. What are the greatest job needs in the conservative movement right now? And what skills should college students focus on developing for them? I know you answered that a little bit, but what do you see as the greatest need yourself?
Oh, happy to elaborate on that. Just from curating a list of new job openings for the last 10 years or so, I know two categories are always in demand, kind of broadly, and that is fundraising and communications. Those two categories make up usually half the jobs that I publish that I'm kind of asked to advertise for employers. Uh, Fundraising is a broad category because it can entail doing interpersonal sales. It could mean being a database specialist. It could mean doing online fundraising using traditional marketing techniques. But nonprofit employers are always hiring for fundraisers. So that's one area of high demand. So if you're somebody who likes traveling, likes talking to people, likes maintaining relationships, likes to be on the road, if you get into major gift fundraising, kind of relationship management, it's a really rewarding career path in the movement, and you'll never look for a job again. You'll just get poached every 2 or 3 years throughout your career. Always need for fundraisers. With There's usually a general need for communicators, but it's especially a high demand are the people who can do the digital work. I remember early in my career, I believe Heritage had maybe one or two people on staff who specialized in video, and maybe a contractor would help us. And now I think might have 5 colleagues who do video production, and I've seen that play out everywhere. When people in the House and Senate would hire for a digital coordinator, it used to just mean drafting the tweets and the Facebook posts, and now it means filming and editing the videos of the member and making infographics. So a lot of people like to consume their content through video and podcast and graphics. So people who have just baseline proficiency in doing that coming out of college tend to get hired a little faster into those roles. And oftentimes, the more senior communication staff will do the messaging, will do more of the writing and the big picture strategy. And you break into the younger staffer in communications by being able to handle the kind of the grunt work of producing video and graphic design type of content. And there's also always a need for writers. Generally, students coming out of college don't write at a professional level. And it's a common complaint I hear from employers that these junior staff just can't write. So if you really hone in on your writing skills, sooner or later it's going to pay off for you. Embrace the red pen. If someone on the job or in college gives you edits, embrace it, learn from it, and get better each time. Any opportunities you have to put yourself out there and write op-eds or write collaboratively with somebody more senior than you are, embrace it. You'll learn a lot from that process. You can take writing classes, and they certainly help. There's really no substitute for just writing, getting critiques, and doing it over and over again. There's really no job in the movement where you don't do writing to some extent. I mean, we need speechwriters. That's very intensive. We need good journalists. To do policy research, you have to be a good writer. Even beyond the writing intensive jobs, if you work in event planning, you have to be able to write quality landing pages. If you're doing digital media, you still have to write, quality tweets, even if you're only doing 140 characters. So there really are not any jobs where writing won't be beneficial for you. So the kind of earlier you hone in on that, the better. I'll say don't fall into a false sense of security in college. If you get, A's in your class that require writing, but you have 2 or 3 mistakes on a paper that don't sink your grade, you might still get an A in college, but that doesn't translate to the professional world. So if you have a grammar mistake or a typo in a paper in college and get an A, that same thing would get you in trouble on the job if you have a typo in a press release that goes out. So try to aim for everything you write to publish or submit early on to be signature ready. Perfect when it comes to grammar, punctuation, etc. So that way you're in the habit of turning into something polished every time. You're better off developing those habits early in college than you are mid-career, because it's tough to flip that switch if you aren't in the habit of writing that way early in your career. And then lastly, I'll kind of lump these together, event planners and schedulers, people who are very detailed and can make trains run on time. There's always a need for that in the conservative movement. And a nonprofit that could be a scheduler or an executive assistant. Every member of Congress, every cabinet secretary, every White House has schedulers. And places like Heritage, we have event planners. That terminology in a White House is advance. People who can kind of do a high pressure, fast pace type A work are in high demand.
Definitely, definitely. Yes, writing is a very important skill. I've definitely noticed that sometimes writing academically and in a professional setting can be a little bit different. So that definitely, if you're in an internship, learn how to do that before you're applying to jobs. But also, what is more important for getting a job? Good grades and GPA in college or amount of experience in the desired field. And I know this is a very big issue right now because I've seen a lot of organizations kind of dropping the requirement to have a degree. We've had some different industries in Florida do that recently. So I'd be interested to know your answer.
Oh, love the question.
Mhm.
I'll say it depends on the job, which I know is a huge cop out, but it is true. I'm thinking specifically at think tanks, if you're going to a career track that's more academically focused, if you're producing scholarly research policy wise, I think you'll usually need to have at least a bachelor's degree for that. And when employers are hiring for those roles, people who are fresh out of college, GPA means a bit more there than it does for most roles. So you're looking to become a policy analyst or research fellow. Um, the GPA will matter a bit more at the get-go. If you're trying to get into a career as conservative attorney, your GPA will probably influence the kind of scholarship you get, the kind of law schools you get into. If you're looking to go on to grad school, so kind of keep that in mind if you're going along that track. But otherwise, GPA is not that big of a deal, as the experience tends to matter more, especially if it's experience applicable to the job you're looking to move into. You don't necessarily have to have a 4-year degree to be a good graphic designer or to be a good writer or to be a good event planner. Having skills and experience to back them up tends to matter more. If you're in a 4-year school or 2-year school, grades matter a little bit. If the GPA falls, too far below 3, people will wonder if there isn't attention to detail, or that might become a bit of a yellow flag at least. So you definitely try to keep your GPA at least over 3. If it sinks under, there are always good reasons why. It's not a deal killer for most employers. But someone who has a 3.5 with experience and skills will probably trump someone who has a 3.9 without experience or skills if they're competing head to head. But ideally, just do them both and don't choose between GPA and experience. But I tend to favor experience, especially if it means you have a track record of performing well on a job.
Yeah, definitely. Very interesting. We had a good question come in with the chat, so I thought I would switch over to that for a second. Um, how would you recommend applicants prepare for employers to request either writing samples or require a writing exam as part of the application process?
Oh, good question. As best you can, try to figure out what the samples are going to be, which you can usually do if you look into the industry of the employer ahead of time. So if you're hoping to get a job as like a press assistant or eventually press secretary, the House or a Senate or for a cabinet secretary, or you're trying to do an equivalent job with a PR firm, figure out what the common deliverables would be on the job. And that shouldn't be too hard to figure out. It's probably in the job descriptions. If you don't see job descriptions for the positions, look up people on LinkedIn who have the job and go look their experience and read their bullet points, figure out what their job looks like. And you'll figure out that what they're drafting most often are probably op-eds or press releases, or even just drafting talking points in media interviews. So try to figure out what the norm is for the industry. See if you can get yourself samples ahead of time that you have a chance to write carefully and hopefully get a peer or a colleague to edit and look over for you. But the type of sample will vary, by industry. So it's good to kind of figure out what those are going to look like and get those in advance. If you're kind of on the spot for a sample and you haven't written one that fits the exact mold of what you're doing in the job, and you are on a time crunch, the best you can probably do is find your best paper you've written for school that's got the best grade, that's perfectly edited, and send that in. It's nice to see a sample deliverable if you're an employer, but if an academic paper shows that you know how to string words together, that you are understanding, punctuation, grammar, you write proficiently, and it shows good writing, that works as well. They just want to see that you can write. A reason employers will do writing tests is to see how well you write, not just how well you get papers edited or how carefully you write, the course of a week or so. They want to see how you do in a job-like situation, like a close simulation. The best you can do there is really just embrace your writing training in your classes and just write as much as you can. I'm sure it sounds cliche by now, but you just get better at writing the more you do it. So the more you can do to make yourself a generally proficient writer, the better equipped you'll be for those situations. It's very common on Capitol Hill for people who are going for jobs as legislative correspondents, where they'd be writing letters for the member of Congress, to have to write a simple letter within an hour. That's very common. And that's something you can practice doing without even having been on the Hill, is writing those letters. If I can make a quick shameless plug, Heritage hosts every 3 months or so a training called Ready Set Hill, where it's like a 2-day intensive training for aspiring Hill staff that's either in DC or remote, just hybrid. And actually have a writing coach kind of teach the students how to write one of those letters. And then the students write a sample letter and get it critiqued. So take that training, Ready Set Hill, and you'll at least have one writing sample and get a little bit exposure to that before those interviews.
Yeah, definitely. It's good to check into all the resources available to, always improve your writing, especially if you're trying to go for a position that you're going to be writing a lot, which are most positions. So, another very interesting question. If someone doesn't already have a DC address, how is the best way to indicate that they're seriously willing to relocate for the position?
Good question. If you're in college and it's pretty clear you're on campus, somewhere like Texas, California, really far from DC, I usually advocate not putting your address, your city and state on the resume. If it's not to your advantage to put it there, I don't think you need to put it up top and kind of advertise that. But if the position's in DC and you're far out and you're worried the employer will notice that, you can always add to your cover letter that you're willing to you're willing to come into town and meet at their convenience, and say you'll be ready to relocate to DC on X date. On LinkedIn, I think there's a way that you can indicate you're open to jobs. And within that kind of notification, you can also specify where you're willing to move to relocate to. So if you're going to put the kind of job seeker tag on your LinkedIn profile, you can definitely mention you're open to relocating to Washington, D.C. That can be helpful to do while you're coming out of school. If you're going to graduate, you don't need to be coy about being on the job market. It's kind of expected. So you can embrace that and also put on there, DC as one of your kind of targeted cities that you hope to move to. And one little nuance that can help if you're graduating, next May, and you're thinking about that kind of application cycle, it helps to know that a lot of employers in the conservative movement hire on a tight turnaround. So most organizations are not big enough to hire in waves like a Fortune 500 company. It's like or like a consulting firm, you don't usually have a full-time job lined up a year out from graduation. It usually happens at or right after graduation. Because organizations typically have to hire someone if someone else leaves a position, or if a need kind of arises a year out. Or if you're looking at, like a White House, that hiring happens, at the outset, January of that given year. And then there's kind of a steady, hiring afterwards at a slower clip. If you're looking to break onto Capitol Hill, it's the same kind of timing, but usually faster. The hiring and jobs you start in January, 2 months after the election. So it helps to keep in mind that timing can be a little bit tricky with these things. Um, Nonprofits will often be patient enough to wait maybe 3 months from offer to actually starting a job. It'll vary a bit by employer. But if you're applying for a job in January for a nonprofit and you're graduating in May, one thing I've seen work recently is applicants who will kind of embrace that and specify the cover letters that although I'm graduating in May and able to relocate at the end of the month, at the end of May, I'd be happy to work remotely and part-time in the meantime. As I've seen some people get jobs in February, work part-time remotely until they graduate and then move to the city and ramp up. That's one tactic you can take in your cover letters and your messaging if you're applying early for nonprofit and private sector jobs, with the conservative employers. But generally, if you're just applying for jobs in the movement and you're not in the DC area, if it gets not to your advantage, you don't have to put that in your cover letter or on your resume. If an employer really wants to know, they'll ask you or have that built into the field of an application.
Yeah, and we actually had a webinar earlier this week where we talked about resumes and cover letters, and we talked about how you would be surprised how flexible people can be if you are very upfront in your cover letter about your situation, and that's very important as well. So for jobs in politics, how often do employees have to moderate their views and opinions? Would you advise not taking a position somewhere you might have to self-censor or where you don't 100% align politically?
Sure, that's tough to answer because it's so personal to the individual, professional job seeker, and kind of how they feel about things. So I'll try to give out a few maybe general principles and some precedent. One thing to bear in mind is that definitely if you work for a member of Congress, for a senator, for president, cabinet secretary, I mean, your views don't matter. Your whole job there is to advance, the members' views, and their agenda, and kind of represent them. A lot of nonprofits will vary a little bit. Like Heritage, we have a policy called One Voice, where we might have debates internally about the right course on a policy track, but once Heritage reaches a consensus, we have one public position, one institutional voice. Um, Other think tanks might be a bit different, where their scholars can publicly disagree with each other on issues. It'll vary a bit on the nonprofit side of kind of how stringent it is to kind of be supportive of institutional position. I'd say, well, I'm lucky that I just happen to agree with Heritage 100%. So I haven't dealt with this personally. One thing you want to think about is how strongly do you feel about the issues that you might disagree with your employer on? Um, I mean, there are a lot of public policy issues out there, so it's not common to agree with an employer or a member of Congress 100%. But you want to ask yourself, which ones do I really care most about? Which ones would I just feel terrible or I feel comfortable publicly supporting if he or she were to go the other way. So figure out your really core things, the ones that are non-negotiable for you, that you feel most passionate about, and find employers who align with those. And if you find an employer who you can get a job with who doesn't align with you, just don't do it. This very seldom ends well when the junior staff doesn't support the messaging or the priorities of the boss.
Yeah, I definitely agree. It probably depends on how big the issue is and definitely how big of a conflict it is for you. As someone who used to work in the Florida legislature, I can tell you it's very rare that everyone agrees on everything, especially, I mean, the Florida legislature is very red. So it depends on how big the issues are.
You have to
Um,
figure out like what you're passionate about and what's core to your values and what is maybe a policy preference or your own leaning. That's something people can really only answer for themselves.
And just a reminder for everyone, I have one more question from me for Kyle. So if anyone wants to drop some questions in the chat, I would do that now. All right. So if one is just starting out, what do you think are some of the best ways for recent graduates to make connections in DC?
Oh, I'm guessing joining the Network of Enlightened Women's professional chapter. After doing that, going to public events is helpful. I think people often underestimate how many events there are that are just kind of open to the public. Think tanks, like Heritage will every probably once twice a week will host a public event based around some policy issue or issue of the day. And those events, there's usually a few panelists who are experts and very involved in the field. And these things often will have receptions afterwards where you can kind of meet panelists or meet other people like you who are interested in the issue area. So going to those talks can be really helpful. You learn, you get to meet people, and they can put a face to a resume. That you can kind of become a known entity within that community and get a better feel for maybe the staff who work there who are around the events. So going to public events and lectures can be really helpful. And this depends on where you go to school, but I'm always surprised at how eager alumni are to help other alumni. So if your school is a good alumni network in DC, finding the Facebook or LinkedIn page for that and going to those events can be helpful. So alumni love to help each other. Depending on the season, there could be a lot of events around DC. There tend to be a lot of Christmas parties in DC, so finding those and going to those can be helpful. This tend to be very social times a year. In DC, there's the congressional baseball game every year. It tends to be pretty good networking. And then beyond just kind of big events, I also recommend doing kind of being more intentional with networking. So instead of going to big events, maybe finding one person at a time you would love to talk to and get insight from. Kind of being proactive about pursuing intentional, informational networking. So if someone is maybe a few years older than you are and is on the career track you want to go down, finding a way to meet that person, whether it be being introduced, by newer heritage to that person, or just doing it yourself over LinkedIn. So finding a kind of intentional one-on-one people to meet, and then if those conversations go well, one of your last questions to the person you talk to should be, who else should I talk to? And then you can kind of follow a chain from there and kind of do a more kind of focused networking track in DC.
Yeah. So someone in the chat wrote, sometimes I feel super uncomfortable when networking, especially in DC. What are some tips to overcome this? And I can definitely relate because I know the first time I went to a political event or just like a social networking event, it is scary. So how can people kind of feel comfortable doing that for the first time?
That's a great question. I relate to that. I'm a pretty classic introvert myself, and I don't usually enjoy those types of events. They can be overwhelming for me too. I get that. One thing that helps is to go into it with a specific and kind of modest goal of meeting 3 new people. And that way you don't feel like you have to work the whole room or be in the middle of every 5, 6 person conversation. So maybe making a more modest goal like that. If you have a few questions that you'd like to ask, and it can be helpful if it can become more of a routine, like we asking someone, oh, so where are you from originally? No one, hardly anybody in DC is from DC originally. So you ask where they're from, where they go to school, and that gets good conversation going. If you want to keep a conversation quick, you can always say, you need to go to the bathroom or need to get a refill, or let me check out, the food over here before it goes away. So there are ways to kind of mitigate I think the awkwardness of it. And if you have kind of modest goals and you have a few questions ready to go to kind of get conversations moving.
Definitely, definitely. We have another question. If we live in strongly liberal locations, how can we be able to obtain internships or other opportunities, especially if the organizations we want to apply for ask for references?
Good question. Well, it's one of, I guess, many reasons to be involved with conservative groups on campus. They can kind of help you kind of get connected to people who would be better references, or they could be your references. Using professors and teachers is fine. I don't think your references have to be conservative. They just have to say nice things about you. So if you find someone who's apolitical or be liberal or moderate, but nice and professional about it and willing to help, that's good too. employers can figure out if you're conservative or not just by asking questions in interviews and looking at online presence. With references, they're usually looking more into your professional skills and kind of your general kind of character. So if your references aren't conservative, it's not a big deal, yeah, at the outset. General advice for liberal cities: if you're near state capital, there are bound to be at least a few, state reps or senators who are conservative. He would probably welcome the help in the legislature. Just about every state has a state policy network affiliate. I'm from Ohio, so that's Buckeye Institute, although I'm happy to say that Ohio is getting more conservative these days. But even the left wing states usually have at least one state think tank that's more free market oriented. And then also look at the Family Policy Alliance Network. There are a lot of family policy council groups near most state capitals. I'm sure it'll also be happy to have the intern help. And beyond kind of on the ground, there are more and more groups now that hire partially or entirely remotely. So if you're open to working remotely, there are groups you could work with. You're conservative, while you're kind of physically based in more of a blue state or blue city. I guess you'd know better, but I believe Network Online Women hires entirely remotely. So that's one option if you want to intern work with new. Foundation for Government Accountability, FGA, was entirely remote even before COVID. Like, I think one of the originals who were doing that. Independent Women's Forum is, I think, entirely remote. They're hiring. There's a great pro-life group, Institute for Women's Health. They hire remotely. American Philanthropic is like a conservative fundraising firm that helps conservative groups with their fundraising and management. They hire for a lot of positions that are remote. So I think there's some opportunity there as well with kind of the remote employers who are open to that.
Yeah, definitely. Remote work has definitely changed that. And yes, at New we work remote. Everyone's all over the place. And my husband also works in the conservative movement, and they're also remote. There are people from all over the country. So there's a lot of options up there. Um, there's another question. Can you use high school teachers as references? And I will follow that up with if you're someone that maybe you didn't do an internship, maybe you just had a different situation, maybe you worked part-time through college, what are some contacts people can use for a reference on a job application that you would say are good to seek out?
Oh, good question. A high school teacher um, could be a good reference. It depends where you are. If you're like a freshman in college, that makes more sense. If you're junior, senior in college and further along, you should be getting references who are college professors, or people you worked for part-time in college. Oftentimes it's good to have a blend, maybe one academic reference, maybe one or two work references. If you work part-time but don't work in the kind of policy or politics space, it can still be good to have references who were supervisors, maybe if you're working retail, fast food, etc. If you can demonstrate hard work, good work ethic, showing up on time, being detailed, good with people. You can demonstrate transferable skills outside of policy space. So if you have a reference from any kind of job, you can speak to that. It's very helpful. So I think those are usually your best references if you're applying for a position where there are one or two skills you want to be able to emphasize. Maybe having a professor is good for that. If you're trying to go down the international relations, foreign policy track, it could be good to have a professor who can say, yes, this person is very good in class, good critical thinker, strong writer. So sometimes it helps to have a teacher professor reference, but definitely usually you want to have at least one or two professional references. And the best professional references are usually people who supervised you, because your future supervisor would love to hear from your previous supervisor that you were a good employee and a good hire. Beyond those two, I don't want to create more work for you at new, but if you are really active in your new chapter, new staff or new leaders could also be good references. If someone you've kind of worked with closely on kind of growing a chapter or kind of doing work on campus.
All right, so I think we have time for one more question. So we have a very interesting one in the chat. She said, you landed the job. How do you network externally with folks and talk about the work that you do without revealing too much of your company's internal initiatives? What are the general best practices to remember?
Oh, that's a great question. I think once you're on a job, you'll have a good sense of what's internal and what's not. You need to use really good judgment on where you should apply discretion and where you can, be more candid or where you can, talk more at length about things. Things you usually want to keep more internal or maybe internal metrics or um, maybe forthcoming initiatives that haven't been launched yet or things like that or that type of thing. Or you're just to hire somebody, but hire hasn't been announced yet. You don't get out in front of your employer and you say, "Oh, so and so just got hired here." Like, what? I hadn't heard that. Don't get out in front of people on hires and departures and personnel changes. Um, but usually, I mean, if you apply just good judgment, you'll know what should stay internal, what was okay to talk about. Um, Ideas are usually safe to talk about, policy ideas and maybe strategy. You don't say my employer's going to do this, but you might say, big picture. I don't know how we're going to rein in the federal budget, or you can talk about values and policy. That's usually kind of safe ground that isn't necessarily internal.
Definitely,
And
definitely.
you also talk about skills. You can say, I'm having a tough time with this new update of InDesign. What's your experience with it?
Hmm. Yeah, and it's you can always talk about things that, especially if you have a president of your organization, like what do they talk about when they go on podcasts, stuff like that. Like Karen talks a lot about opportunity feminism. So oftentimes when I'm telling people what I do, I'll bring that up and tell them about that and why we believe in that.
And I also suggest as a best practice, if you're on a job or if you're interning or in a short-term position that has a fixed end date and you're applying for your next positions, I think it's always a good courtesy to ask your supervisor to look at your resume, the section where you describe your work there, and ask him, does this look okay to put on a resume, or is this internal or this kind of close hold? Years ago, and this wasn't a heritage intern, I talked with an intern about the resume who said that she dealt with dozens of irate donor calls every day. Okay, maybe it's a good experience on the resume, but that makes your employer look pretty bad if donors are irate. So you want to be careful about how you kind of message your current position, make sure it reflects well on that employer, and make sure that it's also tactful. And the person you work for directly will have a pretty good sense of that, of what should stay internal, what shouldn't.
Definitely, that's a very, very good tip. So Kyle, thank you so much for joining us. We had such a great conversation. I think there's a lot of good tips for the ladies in our network. Do you have any final words, any final advice, anything final that's nuanced to getting a job in DC?
Ooh, I love the question. I'll say, know you have an email address. Feel free to drop in the chat and share with everybody here. I'd be happy to talk one-on-one anytime about your job searches or more big picture about your career planning. I know I touched often on working in a White House someday, but I forgot to make the direct plug. If you're interested in doing that someday, I highly encourage you to look at project2025.org. It's Project Heritage is working on to try to get ready to govern if there's a conservative in the White House in January 2025. So through that program, you can put your resume in the transition database if you want to be in the mix for a job in January 2025. And there's also a training program where you can kind of do self-paced video certificate program where you kind of learn how to be a White House staffer. The idea that conservatives will get their resumes ready and in the queue before the transition starts formally, and will learn how to navigate a White House before potentially taking those jobs. That way, you have conservatives who go into these positions knowing how to govern, on day one and not, fake it until they make it or trying to learn on the job. So I highly encourage you to check out, that website if you're interested in maybe someday, serving in DC in a president's administration.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. We definitely love when people share their contact with the students in our network. And if anyone on the chat or on the call wants to have your email address, we can definitely link them up with you and you can help them out.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me.
Yes, thank you so much for joining us. And, thank you all for tuning into this final session of the 2024 New Professional Development Week. We're so grateful to all of our guest speakers from this week, as well as the guest contributors to our blog. So be sure to check that out on our website. Keep an eye on your inbox and our social media for upcoming program announcements. And thank you for joining us. I hope you all have a great afternoon.